Sometimes I think about Job, and I know that the scripture is going to come from Colossians, and we'll get to that in just a minute. And Paul's writing to the Colossians because they're in a mess. They're a little bit in a mess. They've kind of backslid. And I'll tell you what was happening in the church at that time. Sometimes in the Bible we read about false teachers and things like that. Well, there was a lot of that stuff going around. The Bible wasn't even around when Paul was walking around. He wrote most of the epistles that are contained in the New Testament. And so he didn't have a Bible to walk around and to look at. What he had was he had this knowledge as an apostle of Christ, where he had seen Christ on the road to Damascus, and his life had been changed, and so he was on a mission. He was out there to spread the good news. He'd been a Pharisee, and he was a good Pharisee, because he chased all the Christians down and wanted to persecute them and punish them and like that. But when he saw God, everything changed for him, just like it changes for us when we see him. It's the same thing. But we can get lost. And I thought about Job when I was looking at this, and Job was in a mess. I don't know if you know anything, if you've really studied the book of Job, but it was just a mess. Poor old Job. Here he is. He's out there. This is probably before Abraham and that kind of thing. And so Job is out there, and he's making his sacrifices and whatever altar that they have, and he's very religious, I'm sure, and he seems to be going to church, and he tries to follow whatever right living there is to follow, and he does those kinds of things. And yet up in heaven someplace, God and Satan are having a little discussion, and Satan says, I'll bet you that if you took all of Job's stuff, you took his family, his big house, all of his land, you get rid of all of his cattle and sheep and all of his possessions, all that stuff that he blesses you for, that he would curse you. And God says, no, I bet he won't. He said, you can do anything you want to, don't kill him. He said, but you can really mess him up, and he did. He did. Remember, he took everything, and then he took his health. He had him scraping boils with a piece of pottery sitting in a heap of ashes. It was awful. And so I thought about that, and I thought about how, as I mentioned before, sometimes we get to this dangerous thing of Thanksgiving. We get to thanking God for things that we already have that other people will never have. Sometimes we just want to get to first base someplace. Most people in the world aren't even in the game. And so it's hard to, sometimes we get caught up in that without marginalizing somebody to be thankful for something else. And so Paul, when he talks to the people, he writes them and he tells them this. He tells them between verses 11 and 20, he tells them this. And he tells them, and he uses great words. He uses words like inheritance. Boy, that's a good word. And we're going to get to that. He says, starting in your bulletin, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience, and giving joyful thanks to the Father, who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Now that's a walk, what Paul talks about. Paul talks about creation's longest walk. The walk that Christ made, the walk that Christ made from the throne of God in heaven to that stable in Bethlehem to the cross on Calvary's hill. Now there's a walk. And I think that that's perhaps what we can be thankful for. No matter where we are, no matter what country we live in, no matter how much material things we have or we don't have, no matter what our health might be, no matter what our relationships might be, I think we can be thankful in those things, in our inheritance, in the incarnation, and the inclusion of us in the family of God. Now, I use 3 I's because I need to keep it simple, because it's tough for me to remember things. So the inheritance. Isn't that a great word? Inheritance is not something that we did. Paul says, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints. He was very careful, because inheritance is not something that we get paid for a job well done. We don't get inheritance because we have earned something. An inheritance is a gift, is what it is. It's because somebody else did something. Or didn't get caught doing something, I don't know. But somebody else did something. That's how we wind up with an inheritance from somebody. Mark Twain once quipped, he said he spent a lot of money researching his ancestry, and then spent about 2 or 3 times more trying to cover it up once he found out what it was. So sometimes inheritance ain't not all we can be, but I thought about that. I thought, how about when a little baby is born? That baby is born into a family that gives that baby an inheritance. Instantly. The baby didn't do a thing. Was just born. And you know, it's the same thing when we enter into the family of Christ, when we receive Christ as our Savior. Instantly, that moment, no matter what else had happened, we enter into that family. That way we have that inheritance. We get to participate in that. Sometimes we think that there's things that we can't participate in because we haven't been good enough. You know? Sometimes I think that in heaven, when you get there, you know, somebody's going to throw a book. There's going to be good things. And there'll be some things maybe in red. You know, I don't know. You know, but you know, maybe somebody's keeping a record of these things. But you know what? If you go through the scriptures, that's not how it works at all. This fellow died and went to heaven, went to the pearly gates. He's there in front of St. Peter. He knows he's going to get the bad news. He knows that there's things in his life. And St. Peter, all he does is open his arms. Come on in. You know? The guy says, "Well, wait a minute." He said, "You sure you got the right guy? Because there's things in my life that I got to tell you I'm a little ashamed of." St. Peter says, "Nah." He says, "We don't keep any records up here." Sometimes I think we like for people to keep records because it keeps some of those scoundrels that we know to be scoundrels out. But boy, if they did, would none of us get in? You know, all of us got something that we come up short with. And the fellow looks over there and he sees a bunch of people over there on the side of St. Peter, and they're beating their head against this spiritual wall up there, and they're clenching their fists, and they're crying, they're stomping their feet, and boy, they're all upset. And the fellow says, "Who are they?" He says, "Oh," he says, "they haven't made as far as you. They still think we keep records up here." You know, so they're punishing themselves. An inheritance. And that's what we get. We get an inheritance from God. It's inheritance out of love. It's inheritance for what somebody did for us. There was a father, John Powell, in his book Unconditional Love. He writes about when he was a chaplain in Germany. And he was a Catholic priest, and he was a chaplain in Germany, and so he was staying in a little room at a convent, and they assigned this little 87-year-old, I know that's young, but they assigned this 87-year-old nun to to take care of her, and she was the dynamo. She was about this tall, you know, and she was just wiry and going, and every time he left the room, she would straighten it up. She straightened the room up. It was amazing. I don't know if you've ever been on a cruise or anything like that. It's amazing on a cruise. They have these orderlies that are assigned to your room, and when you leave, if you walk outside to change your mind and walk back inside, somebody has made your bed. Everything is cleaned up, always put away. I don't know how they do it. They must pass through the walls or something. But she was kind of like that, 87 years old. And every time he'd leave, she'd wax the floors, or she'd wax the furniture, or she'd wash the windows, or she'd hard at work inside there. And one time went back inside, he teased her. He said, sister, he said, you work entirely too hard. And boy, she just reared up on her. She was still on her knees, but she kind of stood up on her knees and looked at him, severely looked at him, this priest, and she said, Father, heaven isn't cheap. And boy, she was right. You know, that cross was a price to pay. And she said, heaven. So her love just showed up, poured out through the things that she did. And it troubles us so much that no records are kept. But it's that love of God that changed everything. In the beginning, Adam started out, and things went good for about a chapter in Genesis. And then it kind of fell apart, with the fruit and that kind of thing. But from Adam, we wound up with death. God tried to have a relationship with us. Abraham came along. Could have been anybody, I think. Just happened to be the Hebrew people. But it could have been anybody, I think. Because what God wanted to do was have a relationship with these people. And so God said, Abraham, do you have faith in me? And Abraham said he did. And so God counted him righteous because of that faith. This was years before any kind of law or anything like that. There weren't any laws. But even with the family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Esau, all those folks, it just didn't seem to work out. They wound up in slavery, and then finally Moses came along. Moses gave them the law, and all of a sudden they knew what they sinned because all the sins were written down in the law. And so they started having to be righteous according to those sins. Well, they couldn't do that either. Time went on. It took them 40 years to get through the wilderness. Eventually, Jerusalem, a wonder city that God had built through his love and taken them in and tried, because the whole idea was that if they were worshiping the one God, that the one God would bless them in such a way that all the other people would see how this one nation with this one true God was living and be drawn to it. But the people wouldn't do it. They got caught up in all the temporal things, and they fell short of that. So God spread them all over the place. The Assyrians took them out. The Babylonians took them out. They rebuilt. But gosh, then the Persians came in, and the Medes, and eventually the Romans came in about the time just before Jesus was born. And what God did is the only thing that he could do. He had Adam and Abraham and Moses and others, but God came as one of us, the incarnate God. God came from the throne in heaven to that stable in Bethlehem so that he could be one of us and be cold and love and cry, but never weaken. That he could show us, he could walk with us and show us this possible. It really is the incarnate God. Paul says he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he may be preeminent. Paul is talking about Christ. He's talking about getting out of, he's talking about doing something unselfishly for somebody else. There was and I like poets. I do. Robert Louis Stevenson. I kind of like him. You know, he went to the Samoan Islands later in his life because his health was so bad. That's what he did. He went to Samoan Island, and they loved him down there. They really did. I guess he was a nice guy. But one of the things that he did was that when he was down there, he noticed that in the Samoan Islands, the only way that they had to get their goods from the ships that came up to the interior, their supplies, was on this old beaten path. It was a bad path, just not a good path at all. And so, with his own money, his own efforts, his own supervision, he had a road built, a nice road that allowed them to come up to where that path used to be. And you know what they called it? The Samoans, they called it the road of a loving heart. And I thought about that when I thought about this message today, this message of thanksgiving, this message of an inheritance, this message of an incarnation, this message of a road of a loving heart that Christ laid out for us that we might follow. There was a young boy that went up to this missionary in this island and reached into a basket and brought out the most beautiful shell that she'd ever seen. Just a beautiful shell. If you get down around some of the islands in the Caribbean, or I guess that's the only place I've ever been, the islands in the Caribbean, but they have beautiful shells down there. I mean, I don't know where they dig them out, I guess. But anyhow, this particular shell, this missionary knew that the shell came from the other side of the island, a whole day's tough walk from where they were. And she commented to him about it. You know what he said? He said, the walk is part of the gift. And I thought about Christ's walk. Christ, the crucial to everything we believe as Christians is this truth that God so loved the world that he made that long walk to come from where he was to where we are. It was impossible to go to him. So he came to us. And we're in a time of, some would say, upheaval. I don't think so. I think that we're just in a time. I think life puts us in time sometimes. I think we can get caught up in times we get comfortable with. And we see monsters where there's no monsters. There may be differences among Christians on a host of other things. We may be divided on theologies. We may be divided, and theology is a big thing, on how we baptize. We may be divided around who gets to take the Lord's table, who gets to take communion. What are our political preferences? What are we comfortable with politically? But there's one thing that we can all agree on, that is that God became flesh. God became incarnate. And I don't care where you are, I don't care what your financial status is, or what your house looks like, or if you have a house, you can understand the inheritance that Christ gives you through his grace. And you can understand the love of a God to become incarnate and to walk with us. And we can be thankful for that inheritance, that incarnation. And the other thing, and the last thing, is that we are included. We're in the inclusion of us in the family of God. That's where we are. When our lives may be upside down. There may be things, there may be relationships that we're having an awful lot of trouble with. But when we receive Christ as our Savior, those things may still exist. But we're also immediately included in the kingdom of heaven. It's not like we got to wait to die. We're already there. It's all done out of love. There was a guy named Claude Barlow. Claude Barlow was a missionary to China. It's just an amazing story. What he did, he didn't have a laboratory or anything where he was as a missionary, but there was this disease in China that was killing people. And if you go around the world and you go to different places, like in the jungle and like that, you'll come across these diseases that people get that nobody has a cure for. They just, either you die or you get well. There's nothing to intervene. No way to get better. So it was one of those diseases. People were dying. They get this disease, they die. And so he studied it, and he wrote his notes out, and he prepared as much as he could with the little laboratory that he had, and he did all that he could. And when he had tapped all of his resources, he gathered together some of those germs, got on a plane and headed to the United States. Before the plane landed, he injected those germs into himself. By the time that he got to Johns Hopkins, where his old professors were, he was sick. And he let them use him as a guinea pig to figure out what it was that he had and what it was that was going to fix it. And they did. And he went back with the serum and saved thousands and thousands of lives. When asked about it, he said, well, he said, anyone would have done the same thing. What he said. He said, I happen to be in the position of vantage and had the chance to offer my body. I don't think anybody, I don't think very many people would have done what he did. I don't care. He may say that. But it'll take a person with a special kind of love. It'll take a person that had a heart for the others around him. And that's the dangerous thing, I think, that we can get into when we're thankful about our circumstances at Thanksgiving. I think we can forget about having a thankful heart for the others around us. What can we do for the people around us? Right? Sometimes folks go into a church and they'll say, well, what can this church do for me? When the real question ought to be, what can I do for this church? Love makes all the difference. It's that very special kind of love proceeding from the heart of God that holds this whole world together. That love that made that longest journey from God's throne to that stable, to that cross. Without that love, we are all orphans in a strange and hostile universe, but that love does exist. It exists in this church, and it exists among people around this earth who have had their encounter with that man from Nazareth. Amen.